morning. The subcommittee will come to order. We are pleased to welcome back to the House Ambassador Green. We appreciate your being here today, Mr. Ambassador, and we are proud of the fact that you represent us to the world, really, the House, that is, for your honorable service here a few years back. We look forward to hearing from you on how the budget request supports the administration's national security strategy, as well as the Department of State and USAID's joint strategic plan, while decreasing the reliance on foreign aid. I want to thank our full committee chairman, who I think will be here at some point during the hearing, and the ranking member for their leadership on these issues. Chairman Frelinghuysen is well-versed on foreign assistance, and so I'm pleased to have his interest and input as we proceed. Last year, Ranking Member Lowy and I continued our long-standing tradition of working together to advance our shared goals, and I expect that we'll continue that process through the appropriations process again this year. The President's fiscal year 2019 budget request is for programs within the jurisdiction of this subcommittee in the amount of $41.7 billion, which is $12.3 billion, or 23% below current 2018 enacted level. I'm once again dismayed by the magnitude of these cuts. Even after a budget agreement was struck, proposing such a significant cut for the second year in a row calls into question the value the administration places in diplomacy and development, and is an irrefutable contribution to our national security. While I support many of the goals proposed in this budget request, the funding levels requested as compared to the enacted current level call into question how such goals would be met. For example, the budget purports to counter Russian aggression, but the funding associated with these efforts is reduced by more than half. The request also claims to support U.S. leadership in global health, yet the budget reduces such funding by nearly 23%. USAID released a new mission statement that emphasizes democratic values, but funding requested for democracy programs is cut by 39%. There is bipartisan support in this subcommittee for continued investments in soft power, particularly at a time when diplomatic and development challenges have grown, both in number and complexity. Just as we did in fiscal year 2018, this subcommittee will carefully review the proposals in the budget request, assess the current diplomatic and development challenges, and determine the funding amounts for such programs and activities within our allocation. In addition to setting funding levels, the State Foreign Operations Bill will continue to focus on oversight and ensuring transparency for every taxpayer dollar spent. Before closing, I want to mention USAID's reorganization, or transformation, as I understand you now call it. We discussed this at your last hearing, and I had a chance to discuss it with you yesterday in my office, and I want to thank you for your efforts to share the additional information. Your staff and you have been very forthcoming with this subcommittee, and we appreciate that especially. I know you're just beginning your outreach on the details of the proposals, so I encourage you to keep us informed and be open and responsive to feedback, as you already have done. I also urge you to proceed carefully. The transformation touches nearly all aspects of the agency. Implementation will need to be done in a manner that enables USAID to implement, monitor, and evaluate programs and activities in a timely manner. Finally, I want to thank the men and women of USAID who are doing important work around the globe during very difficult times, both abroad and here at home. And we appreciate their service to the country, as we do you, Mr. Ambassador, and your staff here. Let me now recognize Madam Ranking Member for her opening remarks. Ms. Lowy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Administrator Green. Thank you for joining us today. Since your confirmation, I have been impressed by your passion, your dedication to USAID, and the important work of our development professionals. You demonstrate a commitment to bettering the lives of the most vulnerable, including almost 70 million displaced men, women, and children around the world. And yet you come before us today to defend the Trump administration's budget, which will once again cut 30% from our development efforts. If enacted, it would not only hamstring our diplomacy, it would substantially harm the development capabilities of USAID, recklessly undermine U.S. leadership, put our embassies and staff at risk, stymie our efforts to counter violent extremism, and fight terrorism and harm the very people you and your agency are so dedicated to helping. Some of the most catastrophic parts of this request ignore the impact of climate change on national security, zero out funding for food aid and vulnerable children programs, and severely cut historically bipartisan programs such as bilateral family planning, basic education, water and sanitation, the Global Fund, PEPFAR, nutrition, and international disaster relief. Many of the lawmakers in this room and throughout Congress understand that our national security is strongest when development, diplomacy, and defense are equally supported. We cannot make America stronger by eliminating the programs that make our nation more secure. As a result, I am confident Congress will again reject these insufficient levels and instead boost our international investments. But I am gravely concerned by the long-term damage this administration is inflicting on USAID. The president, who seems to view development assistance as ill-advised charity, does not seem to appreciate that global challenges do not have military solutions alone, and, quote, soft power is a fundamental tool of our national security. As Secretary of Defense Mattis said, America's got two fundamental powers, the power of intimidation and the power of inspiration. Soft power is largely found in the power of inspiration. Our foreign and civil service officers at USAID and state are the backbone of our overseas efforts. Without them, we are unable to promote American interests, build relationships, and help those most in need. In addition, while I appreciated the opportunity to discuss USAID's transformation plans with you yesterday and acknowledge the improved consultative process since your arrival, this committee continues to have serious concerns regarding the administration's so-called, quote, reorganization and redesign efforts at state and USAID. To date, the effort has led to stagnation, confusion, and low morale throughout the agencies that execute our foreign policy. As you know, I have consistently said that I support reforms to make our overseas programs more efficient and accountable. However, any redesign at state and USAID will not be sustainable over the long term without congressional assent, and the lack of communication from this administration, including OMB, on reorganization efforts will not lead to sustainable reforms. Again, thank you for appearing today. I look forward to our discussion. And I must tell you again, as I've said both publicly and privately, it is very special for me to have a person of your experience and of your commitment in this position. Thank you for appearing before us today. Thank you.
Mr. Director, we'd like to hear from you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Rogers, Ranking Member Lowy, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for this opportunity to summarize my written testimony. I would like to begin this morning by welcoming the nomination of Director Pompeo. I had the opportunity to initially discuss with him how development and diplomacy go hand in hand, and I very much look forward to working with him closely should he be confirmed. In the meantime, as many of you have alluded to, at USAID we have urgent work to do. From unprecedented humanitarian challenges to exciting development opportunities, our work has never been more important. That has certainly been a clear takeaway from my travels over these last 8 months. I've just returned from Peru and the Summit of the Americas. While there, Acting Secretary Sullivan and I met with courageous pro-democracy activists from Cuba. They shared with us that this is a critical moment in Cuba's history and urged us to support seeds of true liberty and democracy, not only for Cuba, but for Venezuela and elsewhere around the hemisphere. In fact, much of the recent summit focused on Venezuela. The Vice President and I announced $16 million for our humanitarian response to the flight of Venezuelans from the Maduro regime. This displacement of families is unprecedented in Latin American history. What makes the tragedy even more painful is that it is entirely man-made. It is caused by the Maduro regime's continued mismanagement and corruption. And similar forces are causing humanitarian crises in nearly every corner of the globe. Near famines continue to rage in Nigeria, Yemen, Syria, and Somalia, all man-made. As I know you agree, in order to fully respond to these crises, we need to address their underlying causes. Just as we lead the world in humanitarian assistance, we should also lead in our commitment to democracy, human rights, and responsive governance. Our fiscal year 19 budget request includes funding for our democracy and governance programs in Venezuela that support civil society, the democratically elected legislature, and the free flow of information. Last month, I addressed the UN Security Council on the crisis in the DRC. I urged the Kabila government to hold credible and inclusive elections by the end of the year. And I am deeply concerned, as I know you are, over reports of horrific human rights abuses in Burma, in the northern Rakhine state. I will soon be traveling to Burma and Bangladesh to assess this situation firsthand. Members of the subcommittee, I have had the chance to discuss with many of you the rising negative influence of Russia and China. Many of you have noted a disturbing global trend toward the repression of basic liberties. Many of you have pointed out that these are significant challenges not only for our interests, but for the future of the countries involved. In response, our 19 request includes targeted investments in Europe and Eurasia that support democratic institutions and civil society while countering the Kremlin influence. We also recognize that China's investments in developing countries are rarely aimed at actually helping those countries achieve their economic independence. Often they come with real strings attached. We must offer these countries a better choice. We should offer to help them on their journey to self-reliance, not burden them with unsustainable indebtedness. Members of the subcommittee, the fiscal year 19 request for USAID fully and partially managed accounts is approximately $16.8 billion. This represents $1.3 billion more than requested last year, including $1 billion for humanitarian assistance. We readily acknowledge that this request will not provide enough resources to meet every humanitarian need or to seize every development opportunity. Indeed, no budget in modern times has. This request attempts to balance fiscal needs at home with our leadership role on the world stage. And our work has never been more important, or sad to say this morning, more dangerous. In April alone, we've seen humanitarian workers killed in South Sudan and Yemen simply for trying to ease the suffering that pervades both countries. We're committed to taking every step to extend the reach and effectiveness of our taxpayer resources and to try to protect our staff and partners. We're also committed to working closely with this committee to ensure that your ideas are reflected in our agency's transformation plan. Finally, I would like to say a quick word about recent published reports of sexual abuse and misconduct by aid workers. Like you, I am deeply troubled by the allegations. Needless to say, sexual exploitation violates everything we stand for as an agency. I have met with partner organizations and made it absolutely clear that USAID will not tolerate sexual harassment or misconduct of any kind. And we have taken numerous other steps and actions and we'll do whatever else it is that we need to do. I assure you this is an action and an issue that I'm personally tracking. With your support and guidance, we will ensure that USAID remains the world's premier international development agency. And with that, Mr. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity to appear, and I welcome your questions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Your team began consultation with our subcommittee on your proposed reorganization 2 weeks ago. And we appreciate the fullness of those briefings and look forward to ongoing consultations and formal notification as required in the 018 bill. I understand that the Inspector General recommended a number of key areas for you to focus on as you develop the reform plan. It seems to me this reorganization presents an opportunity for a more efficient and effective agency if you can address those chronic management challenges that we've seen for a long time. Explain to us how your proposed reorganization will address the top management challenges identified by the Inspector General.
Great. Pat, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the role of the OIG at USAID. She or a representative sits in our senior management meetings every week, and I've also very much appreciated their role in the process of transformation. So we have already incorporated a number of their recommendations into our redesign process and will continue to do so as we go forward. That's an important part of the work that we do in making sure that whatever we do is sustainable. I should also point out that we've worked very hard to take the constructive work of the OIG and build them into both our programming and our overall operations. In the last 6 months, we've reduced the backlog of audits from OIG by 75%. They were at 100 last year. They're down to 23, and we're on track to eliminate the entire backlog by June. And so we continue to incorporate those results. But in the process of redesign, we have worked closely with OIG, making sure that we take the office input and incorporate them into the design process. Finally, I'd like to say one of the things of which I'm most proud with respect to the redesign process, all of the work that we have done, the 5 principal work streams, which is how we organize the recommendations, since day one have been led by our career staff. We believe it's the best way to make sure they reflect the years of experience and best ideas that we have at USAID. And we also believe it's the only way to make the work sustainable. What we're looking to do is to make sure that USAID is not only the world's premier agency today, but it continues to be in the years ahead. And that's really the spirit within which or under which this whole process has been undertaken. And that includes involving the Office of the Inspector General to make sure that we take their counsel, their input, and incorporate it into our work.
As I mentioned in my opening remarks, one thing that has stood out thus far that I've seen is that the reorg would touch nearly the entire agency. But it's one thing to develop a proposal for a reorganization of this scope. Implementation, though, is where the real work begins. I previously chaired the at that time new Homeland Security Subcommittee, trying to help merge 23 agencies into an effective organization. That work is still going on and far from completion. So this likely will be a long-lasting effort. Do you agree with that?
Very much, Mr. Chairman. We are, again, we've organized the recommendations that were produced by our staff into 5 work streams, and the only one that we have really sort of gone public with at this point is the structural piece, because you're exactly right. This will take months and months to do, and we will do it the right way. So I absolutely agree with that.
Well, undertaking such significant reforms as you are over a short period of time could impact your ability and your effectiveness in delivering and monitoring foreign assistance in the meantime. How are you reassuring us that your agency's work will not suffer due to the amount of work required to reorganize and reform?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A number of ways. First off, our commitment in monitoring and evaluation continues unabated and will continue to be a part of every one of our programs and projects. Secondly, we continue to be in consultation with the Office of the Inspector General to make sure that we are constantly getting that feedback as well. And also, the work that we are doing is led by our experienced career staff and making sure that we are doing things, again, the right way. But I think the most important point is the one that you began with. This will take quite some time and is intended to be done gradually, each step building on the other, in full consultation with your staff and the other committees of jurisdiction. We have provided more than 40 briefings so far to members and their staff, and will continue to do that. We look at our consultation role as just that, consultation, not notification, not informing, but coming forward, showing you what our career staff have produced, the logic behind it, what the implementation plan is, getting your feedback, making sure that what you bring forward is incorporated and considered in the work and the way that we do it. So we're absolutely committed to it. All of the changes that we're looking to do, whether they be in structure, which is actually only about 20% of the work, but the other changes, they're all really built around what I've been talking about since the day I was nominated. We believe that the purpose of foreign assistance must be to end the need for its existence. And so everything that we're trying to do is to work with country partners, assess capacity, commitment, and work with them on their journey to self-reliance, so that one day, if the steps are taken and the commitments are made and the work is done, these countries will be able to lead their own development, and that's the goal. What we believe is what we're looking to do through transformation, which is identifying metrics, is making sure that our programming reflects assessments that are done in the field and are field-driven, to cross-fertilization of best ideas. All of it is with that in mind. That's the way that we believe that we live up to the commitments that we've made to all of you, our generous funders.
Have you reduced your reorganization plan to a chart yet?
You've seen it. We've actually given our proposal on the structure. We have briefed your staffs with that. So yes.
I've seen the chart. I didn't know whether it was public yet or not.
Well, it's part of consultation, so it is not finalized, but we're taking your input. We don't believe it's finalized until we've had an opportunity to hear more from your staff and incorporate all of that.
Do you have that chart available for us?
We'll get it to you again today, absolutely.
Yeah, I think our members would like to see it.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen it, and two things strike me. One, you're naming two new associate
administrators. Yes.
One essentially over contents of programs. The other, in a simplified way, an operations director, I guess you would call it. Is that right?
That's the proposal. That's what we are putting out for discussion and your feedback.
Yeah,
yes.
I was struck by it looks like the wisdom of doing that. So I salute you in that regard so far. Now, you have consulted OMB about the plan. Is that correct?
Yes, we have.
And what do they say?
To date, the feedback has been very constructive. They've continued to allow us to move forward as we are with you.
Have you had a chance yet to discuss this with Secretary-to-be Pompeo?
I have not. He has been otherwise occupied recently, but the single conversation that I had with him, substantive conversation a couple of weeks ago, and we talked about general notions on development and the role of development alongside diplomacy, were very constructive. And so we believe that the State Department will work closely with the State Department. The redesign that obviously we're talking about here and that you have seen is the USAID redesign. This is not the joint state USAID redesign that was contemplated previously under Secretary Tillerson.
But so far, you've got the green light from the powers that be.
So far, so good, Mr. Chairman.
Before I yield to Ms. Lowy, let me just make one point. You know, we hear, all of us in our home districts and elsewhere, that if we would just reduce foreign aid, we would balance the budget. People have a lot of misinformation about the amount of money that this country spends on foreign aid. I calculated it. All the money in this bill amounts to 4% of total federal discretionary spending. 4 cents on the dollar. I just wanted to be sure that we understood the numbers we're talking about. Sorry?
I apologize, Mr. Chairman, but that's discretionary. If you actually get all of the expenditures, it's not even a rounding error, right? On those.
We'll calculate that while we're talking here. Ms. Lowy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to say again that you are a breath of fresh air, and it's such a delight to have you in this capacity, and I appreciate your experience and your commitment. Following up on the chairman, just tell us today, do you believe a 30% cut to foreign assistance sends a signal that America is abdicating its leadership, moral values, or humanitarian commitments?
Congresswoman Lowy, I believe the administration had difficult choices to make. There was a difficult balance, balancing American leadership abroad versus needs here at home, and I think this budget request reflects that.
Do you agree that you personally?
So, Madam Chair, what I would say, Ranking Member, is that my obligation is to take the precious money that you provide and to make it go as far as we possibly can with quality programming worthy of taxpayer support. So we are taking steps from working better with the private sector to asking other partners to do more, and they are. Funding is increasing, ODA funding, countries like Germany, Japan, South Korea, and others, and to try to make these dollars go as far as they can. I readily admit this will not meet every humanitarian need, nor will this seize every opportunity that's out there. That is most definitely true.
And I just want to express to you my concerns, which you're aware of. How can the President and his OMB director be so confident that those who fill the void will support our values or care about the national security of the United States? Are you?
We're lucky to have good funding partners in a number of places of the world, but I do not believe there is a substitute for American leadership.
And does this administration believe that military power alone can prevent radicalization or prevent despair that leads to outbursts of violence and instability?
No, and I would point to the Stabilization Assistance Review that has been formalized, Department of Defense, Department of State, and USAID, that talks about the important role of each, as well as the national security strategy. Now, I think the administration recognizes the importance of development diplomacy, and I know that nominee Pompeo does as well.
I look forward, in fact, to discussing these issues with nominee Pompeo as well. So my answer is, and this goes to the facts, then why should the administration propose a budget that undercuts the very programs that prevent radicalization?
Again, Ranking Member Lowy, I think there are tough choices that are being made. I recognize that. I will do everything I can to capitalize on what is provided to us and make it go as far as we possibly can.
Thank you. Another issue which disturbs me is the reimposition of the global gag rule, particularly this administration's unprecedented decision to expand this terrible policy to all global health assistance by inserting the policy into every area of global health: malaria, TB, pandemic preparedness, nutrition, vaccinations, and more. We undermine, in my judgment, our effectiveness and make it harder to reach the most vulnerable. I have repeatedly expressed my concern that the administration did not consider all the potential effects of this expansion, or worse, did not care. We already know the past implementations that the policy increases the rate of abortions and unwanted pregnancies. Can USAID say with confidence that there will be no break in services for even the most remote populations?
First, if I may, you are a passionate advocate on this cause, and you have been passionate about the cause both publicly and with me privately. And what I've pledged to you, and I re-pledge again today, is to make sure that as we go forward in this process that we are absolutely truthful in providing information on what we see. We briefed your staff on the initial 6-month report on the implementation of protecting life and global health assistance. Your staff pointed out with, I think, some evidence that that is only the first part of the report. That was only 6 months into the program. And we have pledged to once again work with the State Department as it provides a year-end review, and we'll report the numbers to you accurately. We will be straight up and show you everything that we see and be very open in the process to make sure, in fact, that we are living up to our commitments.
Well, just for the record, or if you have a response, it really surprises me that more analysis was not done before imposing the global gag rule on all global health, including areas with no connection to pregnancy. What steps were taken to ensure that we would be able to find capable partners to continue providing life-saving interventions?
Thank you for the question. What I can say is, as PLGHA was coming online, USAID, and I'm sure State Department did as well, undertook an education effort with all of our partners and potential partners. 5,300, I believe, were done to make sure that there was clarity around the understanding of the provisions and do everything we can to make sure that there was no disruption. And so that's what we've undertaken to date. And as I've indicated earlier, my obligation to you is, as we conduct this next review, is to be very clear on the impacts and show you the numbers that we have. So now, we're all working off the same facts.
I appreciate that, but I'm sure you realize that in February, State released a report on the first 6 months of the expanded policy's implementation. The report revealed that the policy has caused mass confusion, wasted implementers' valuable time trying to understand and comply with the policy. How will the next review assess and evaluate service disruptions, inefficiencies caused by this policy, and how will USAID address the mass confusion created by this policy?
We will, as we've done to date, make sure that we are in constant communication with grantees, contractees, subs that we work with or that are interested in working with us in the global health area. Again, and this is as of some months ago, had conducted 5,300 outreaches. In the 6-month report, as I understand it, 4 prime grantees and 12 subprime indicated that they would not receive funding, that they would not follow the PLGHA restrictions. But other than that, they were able to shift. We were able to fill the gaps by shifting over the work that they were doing. But again, my promise to you is to be absolutely clear with the facts that we have and the data that we have.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. And because this is so critical in the field, And because of my years of interaction with many of these grantees, I hope that there will be a careful analysis and report, and that there can be a movement in correcting these directives, which seem to be, as I mentioned, causing mass confusion out there in the field. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, ma'am. Mr. Diaz-Balart is going to be recognized, but he brought up a point. We've calculated the percentage of total federal spending that is comprised in this bill, and what we spend on foreign aid is about 1%. About 1% of total federal spending. It's not 25%, it's not a third, it's not a half, it's 1%. Mr. Diaz-Balart.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And before I begin, I apologize. I'm chairing my subcommittee next door, so I'll have to leave after this. But Ambassador, let me again first thank you for your attendance, your leadership at the summit, which you mentioned. I know specifically meeting with civil society members of Cubans, civil society members. You talked about that. Also for your deep understanding of the nature and the reality of whether it's the Castro regime, the Maduro regime, the Ortega regime, and there are fake NGOs. It's frankly refreshing. Also, you mentioned that you and the Vice President's efforts for humanitarian relief for the Venezuelans who are now the refugees who are either in Colombia or Brazil. So let me first ask you something about Nicaragua. State Department's 2017 Human Rights report stated that the Ortega regime was responsible for arbitrary or unlawful killings, torture, lack of independent judiciary. I could go on and on. And last week, unfortunately, we saw that behavior in just all of its colors, right? Where you saw the Ortega regime shut down at least 4 television stations, and frankly, you saw people even dying in the streets. So how much of USAID's funding for Nicaragua is going to civil society and good governance, and how much of it for infrastructure and other development? Do you know?
Thank you. I believe that nearly all of it is going towards civil society, trying to foster voices of civil society and democracy, and to encourage independent media and free voices in the country.
I appreciate that, Ambassador, because if anybody had any false ideas of the nature of
6.5 million is going towards civil society.
Great. I think the notion that regime was a decaffeinated dictatorship is no longer the case. Let me now go to again, you like the decaffeinated part? All right. Let me now talk about, again, and I know that the Vice President and you committed to some serious funding for the humanitarian effort for the refugees of Venezuelans who are struggling with that dictatorship. How will USAID administer your portion of the funding? Will you also work with UNHCR or NGOs on the ground, or how are you looking at doing that, making sure that it gets to the people that need it as opposed to it filtering to the regime that's using all of the resources to repress the people of that country?
Thank you, Congressman. You know, first I'm struck as you're talking. We take a look at some of the world's greatest humanitarian challenges right now, places like DRC and Venezuela. We have countries that should be donors. These are countries that should be, in fact, helping with assistance in the region, and yet they're drivers of the problems. With respect to Venezuela, when I had the opportunity to meet with Venezuelan opposition voices, first off, the suffering is almost indescribable that's taking place. But secondly, their own personal courage is really quite striking and remarkable. What is very clear is that what is happening in Venezuela is not simply a Venezuelan problem, as bad as it is in Venezuela. It is causing potentially dangerous forces to sweep across the region. Colombia, Brazil. I also had a chance to meet with the CARICOM nations, and some of those leaders were warning that they're starting to feel the impact of this surge in migration. So I think it's of severe consequences. So the $16 million that the Vice President and I announced, that was for humanitarian assistance for those who have fled the country. We are also looking for, and it's on top of $2.5 million we had announced about a month ago. We are looking for ways to try to help alleviate suffering in Venezuela. As you know, that is an extraordinarily difficult task because of the Maduro regime's rejection of such assistance. But again, the suffering that we're all seeing is horrendous, and I worry that this is a problem that is going to be destabilizing and damage the entire region's prospects.
And Mr. Chairman, thank you. You've been very, very generous. Let me just, and I appreciate. I think the statement that you just made is a key statement. You're right. It's not just a Venezuelan problem. Would you not agree though that that's the same situation? Because if you look at Venezuela and you look at Cuba, in particular, it's been there even longer. Not only are they problems for the region and the hemisphere, but they have close ties to Iran, to North Korea, to Assad in Syria, and you're seeing an increase of you started seeing an increase of Russian presence in Cuba with their spy ships. So again, it's so refreshing, Ambassador, to you and frankly the administration kind of understands the situation, that just because it's this in this hemisphere, that it's not less of a threat to our national security, but obviously and to the people who are struggling under those dictatorships. So again, it's refreshing, and I look forward to continuing working with you. Mr. Chairman, thank you for your leadership, sir, and I apologize that I have to go next door.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank
we
you,
understand. Ms. Lee.
Thank you very much. Well, since my colleague mentioned Cuba, let me just start by asking you about the, quote, democracy promotion activities, and I believe, and I'm just, my views are just the opposite of our colleague from Florida, because the greater the void and the greater the gap that the United States allows to take place in Cuba because of our lack of engagement, the more it's going to be filled by Russia and other countries. Want to mention to you the situation with Alan Gross, USAID contractor, and want to make sure that U.S. dollars are not being spent in a way that would subject U.S. subcontractors and employees for liability for violating not only Cuban law, but any laws of any country where we're doing what we call democracy promotion work. That's the first question.
Thank you for the question. First, as you know, we are legally obligated to ensure that assistance that is provided to Cuba inure to the benefit of the people and not to the regime or the military. And that's the overriding restriction, legal restriction that is upon us. So we support human rights. We support voices of democracy. We've provided humanitarian assistance to political prisoners in Cuba. That is a long-standing part of our work.
But it's not very transparent, and oftentimes it's perceived as being part of our undercover work.
Well, if I may, and this is true in many parts of the world, as you know, the Brownback Amendment means that in those areas where there is closed or closing space, we balance our commitment to transparency to the security of those with whom we work. So providing assistance to voices in, well, pick your country, in many of the countries with closing space in Russia, wherever it may be, could put them in severe risk. And so we have to balance those important concerns.
Okay, but you didn't answer my question about U.S. contractors and employees such as Alan Gross, who got caught up, unfortunately, in according to the Cuban government, criminal activity and was incarcerated for 5 years. And he was not aware of the laws of Cuba, and so there were no protections by the U.S.
It was obviously long before my time, but I'd be happy to come in with my team and brief you on precisely what we're doing.
Yeah, I'd like to talk with you about that. And let me ask you about the Kim Caston Amendment as it relates to UNFPA. I was at the United Nations this week, and I just have to tell you, the withholding of funds from in UNFPA is really devastating. I believe, and I'm not sure, but I think it's $68 million that have been lost. And these are services, reproductive health care services, maternity health care services, especially in throughout the world in humanitarian situations. So what I'm trying to figure out is, what are you doing with this money? Are you reallocating it to other organizations? How are we filling in the gaps? I mean, these programs, and why was the decision made to stop the funding? I mean, it's really tragic what's taking place.
Thank you for the question. The determination was made by the administration that funding to UNFPA was not consistent with U.S. law and the provisions of protecting life and global health assistance. But to the first part of your question, which I think is key, yes, we are in fact in the process of developing a plan to reprogram that money towards maternal health. And it's not finalized yet. Would be very happy to brief your staff on what it is that we're looking to do with the resources.
Yeah, I think we need to know that because the organizations that are doing this very important work are really, stuck and don't know how to proceed. They don't know what the U.S. is going to do. They're scrambling for resources, and they need to know.
First off, I know that other donors are providing such resources, but in terms of the U.S. resources, we are reprogramming it towards maternal health and would definitely appreciate the opportunity to come in and brief your staff and let you know what we're looking at and what we're trying to finalize, putting together.
And finally, let me just say, I associate myself with all the remarks with regard to these extreme, severe budget cuts, because development and diplomacy seem now to not be a priority. It's primarily defense when you look at the huge increase in defense budget. I mean, you're cutting the budget. You're zeroing out Title II, Food for Peace, within, of course, ag appropriations. We look at Nigeria, Somalia, South Sudan, and Yemen facing extreme hunger and famine. Treasury is requesting to eliminate the contribution for the International Food and Agricultural Development Fund. Are these cuts really necessary? I mean, how are we going to justify cuts when, in fact, the need is greater and we believe in development and I guess development and diplomacy, but I'm not sure anymore.
Congresswoman Lee, you are a passionate advocate and have been for a long time in the cause of development diplomacy, and quite frankly, the agency owes you a great debt for all that you've championed. With respect to the famine response, as you know, the way that the request has been made, IDA funds will be used in part to provide such assistance and support that assistance. In addition, again, I'm not going to suggest to you that we can meet every humanitarian need that's out there with this budget request. That would not be truthful. It's not true. We are trying to balance needs here at home with leadership on the world stage, and my obligation is to do everything I can to make these dollars go as far as I can possibly take them. Leveraging the support of other donors, which is on the increase, which is good news, working better with the private sector, undertaking procurement reform, more effective partners, new partners, refreshing our work. All of those are obligations that we are undertaking.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania who has been a great member of this subcommittee and chairs another of the subcommittees. This is his last hearing with the subcommittee. He's going into the private sector is it May?
Middle May.
So the chair recognizes Charlie Dent.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you publicly for your good friendship and leadership and mentorship to me when you were chair of the full committee and, of course, chair of the subcommittee as well. So thank you, Chairman Rogers, for all you've done to help me in my career here. It's been a great honor serving with you and everybody else on this subcommittee, for that matter. Administrator Green, I'm excited that you're in the position, given your passion and interest and commitment to these issues. I'm thrilled that you are where you are. And I do also want to talk about the budget cuts and the challenge that I think you face and that and those who are concerned about the development mission of this country, that it seems to me that we haven't done a very good job selling development in the United States. Frankly, we haven't done a very good job selling development to the budget director, apparently, at OMB. That's why there's a 30% or 33% proposed reduction. And I suspect that this subcommittee and the full committee at the end of the day will, pull USAID's chestnuts out of the fire and restore some of that, a significant portion of that funding. But I just wanted to get your thoughts about how USAID does a better job, can do a better job selling its mission to the people of the United States. The great work you do overseas is appreciated, certainly, by all of us, but if it doesn't have the support of people at home, and particularly in the budget office, it's pretty hard to sustain the mission.
Thank you, Congressman Dent, for that thoughtful question. I will just, for a moment, say, as I was walking in the jungles of Peru 10 days ago, looking at some of the new cacao plants that were there, I couldn't help but thinking of your district and all the work that you've done around that issue and that crop. To your question, as we undertake our redesign efforts, an important part of that is trying to build the agency around the notion that I think is at the heart of America, and that is that we're not providing handouts. We're providing literally hands up. We're looking to help countries on their journey to self-reliance because we believe in human dignity. We believe that every human being, man, woman, young, old, wants to lead their family, their community, wants their nation to have what we call the American dream. I would argue it's universal. And so we're trying to build around that notion. And I know I come from flyover country in the Midwest. When I talk to people back home about how we're trying to help countries rise, to take on their own challenges, to build their own capacity, and that we're requiring them to commit to do these things in order to do that, what I generally get is, yeah, okay, that makes sense to us. I think they have this notion that we're providing buckets of money to bad guys. Well, as you know, we fund largely NGOs. We don't fund governments. There are very few places where we're actually funding governments, and where we are is for capacity building purpose. Shame on us. We've simply not done a very good job of describing that. I would go further and argue that we have another choice or comparison to lay out, and that is the differing models of development that are out there. China now does development. They provide a lot of money up front, but what they do is the opposite of self-reliance. They essentially impose servitude. What they do is they lock up countries for long-term debts, lines on extractives, and they're looking to essentially push back on all the things that we stand for. So both here at home and I think around the world, we need to be open and say, look, we want to help you rise. You got to do it yourself. It's you're sovereign. You lead. We'll help you get there. You're going to have to make tough choices, but we believe in freedom. We believe in market economies. That's what we stand for. We simply haven't done that very well, and that's on me. That's a job that I need to undertake better.
In my remaining time, though, thank you for that very thoughtful answer. I'm just going to quickly ask you what USAID is doing and to elevate the discussion about your mission towards global nutrition programs. That's very important, and also global health security. And finally, just a quick update on Nicaragua. That's it. Sorry. There's not much time left.
Thank you for those questions. I'll provide quick, brief answers, then welcome the chance to come in and talk with you further and brief you further. On nutrition programs, we are working to build on, I think, the tremendous success of Feed the Future and its nutrition programs. As I've said readily, that's the most important advancement I've seen in development since I was in the field back in my day as an ambassador in Tanzania. We didn't have these tools. It's fabulous. They're really remarkable tools. Secondly, on global health security, it's an area that I have a personal interest in. I've spent some time talking to Dr. Tedros from the World Health Organization, as well as meeting with some of the pandemic experts at a conference at Texas A&M. I think it's, a number of you have pointed to the need to connect this for the average tax-paying American. I think Zika and Ebola do that in spades. What happens in terms of pandemics on far shores is not simply somebody else's problem. It is a real risk to us. And so developing the frontline capacity in these nations to be able to respond and defeat these pandemics overseas before they reach our shores is obviously in our interest. In the case of Nicaragua, we obviously call for the immediate release of political prisoners, an end to the violence. We're trying to support civil society and independent media. I thought Vice President Pence was very eloquent at the Summit of the Americas when he called for a hemisphere of freedom. Obviously, Nicaragua is not there. It is moving in the opposite direction.
Thank you, Mr. Dent. Before I recognize Mr. Ruppersberger, I'm going to ask Mr. Dent if he would take the chair. I'm going to go next door to the Attorney General's hearing, and I shall return, as they say. So, Mr. Dent, if you'd take the chair, Mr. Ruppersberger, okay, you're recognized.
Ambassador, thank you for being here today. It's USAID is so important to the world and our influence in the world. I want to talk to you about China and Russia's influence from a national security strategy. You know, today the United States must compete for positive relationships around the world. China and Russia target their investments in the developing world to expand influence and gain competitive advantages against the United States. China is investing billions of dollars in infrastructure across the globe. Russia, too, projects its influence economically through the control of key energy and other infrastructure throughout parts of Europe and Central Asia. The United States provides an alternative to state-directed investments, which often leave developing countries worse off. I appreciate you mentioning China's growing influence. In your written testimony, they are spending a lot of money and have great ambitions, like the Belt and Road Initiative, that will open markets and create strategic hubs for China. I was maybe 8 years ago, I was in Yemen, and there were looked to be community centers that were built by the Chinese. The only positive news is that the president said, you know, those Chinese, they come in, they spend all this money, but we still don't like them. So I don't know what that experience is with the Chinese throughout, but we also have Russia doing the same thing. Can you discuss how our budget competes against the Chinese development ambitions? How do we ultimately win the influence game when China is throwing around a lot more money than we are? They have more money. What is the impact of U.S. national security and our strategic interest in terms of spreading Chinese influence, and if we have time, Russia influence also? And does your agency provide advice to countries to make sure they don't succumb to bad, unsustainable Chinese debt commitments? Got it?
Congressman, thank you.
Okay.
You have touched upon issues that I think are of vital strategic import, very, very much so. My experience in Africa when I served as an ambassador with respect to Chinese investment was actually similar to yours. At least far-sighted leaders understood exactly what they were getting and not getting with Chinese investment. I worry that perhaps not all leaders recognize until it's too late the long-term indebtedness that they carry and what it can mean for the natural resources that belong obviously to their people, not to anyone else. So we're trying to compete in a number of ways. The Indo-Pacific strategy is based upon incentivizing and capacity building in the area of rule of law, a level playing field. I think we all believe that American businesses can more than compete if there's a level playing field, if there's respect for rule of law, protection of intellectual property, and other such matters. We're looking to build out that work even more.
But as you know, there's so many countries that are so poor, they take what they can get.
And there's an interesting study that I've seen from the Center for Global Development that is talking about the level of indebtedness that a number of countries are carrying and its long-term potential consequences. And it's very, very worrisome, absolutely. I think we need to develop new tools. I think we are doing a better job in development in leveraging the private sector. It is the genius of entrepreneurship in the private sector that is our competitive advantage. And provided that they have those rule of law protection, intellectual property protections, I think we'll do extraordinarily well. But not everywhere provides those protections, and that's work that we have to do. With respect to countering Kremlin influence, I used to lead an organization that under my tenure was declared undesirable by Vladimir Putin, so it is a personal cause for me. I think one of the best ways that we can counter the influence and strength of the Kremlin is success in all the bordering countries. I think the success of Ukraine as it rises, pushes back against corruption, but grows its economy, is energy independent, and has free and independent media, that is the best rebuke that we can possibly provide. So I think we have a great interest in strengthening the democracies, governing capacity, transparency, and civil society of all those countries in the region. I think it's one of the most important things that we can do.
Based on everything you just said, do you feel you have enough in your budget to take on that mission?
I have
also talked about Venezuela, too. Did we want to ask China and Russia involved there at all?
I'm not the expert to be able to speak on that with authority. I want to be careful on that front. I recognize that there are trade-offs in the budget. I will never have all the resources that I need to take on every opportunity that's out there. We'll make the dollars go as far as they can, and we are working on ways to advance our tools in these causes. I think also our voices in multilateral and international fora are very important. I think we need to work hard at building our alliances. There are a number of...
You have a lot on your plate, but my reason for this question, when you're managing and looking at all the issues in all the countries, please make the issues I raised here a priority, especially with respect to China and Russia.
You have my word. I agree with you.
Okay, Mr. Fortenberry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Administrator, welcome. First of all, let me say how fortunate we are to have you in this essential position, given your background and your passion and your previous leadership in this space of international development and economic regeneration and leadership in human rights areas as well. So thank you for your service. Throughout your written testimony, you talked about the word transformation with a big T. You also talked about developing the metrics that are going to be applied across programs. And I think this begs a big question, and I want to touch on that for a moment, then ask you a specific about northern Iraq and the process you've undertaken to assure the possibility that those affected by genocide may be able to return to their homes. In regards to development, I think I'm glad to hear you're rethinking some fundamentals here, because I think we have to ask ourselves, what does that actually mean? If it means that we're going to try to bring some order and harmony and prosperity where there is death and misery and poverty, beautiful, perfect. I think that's the fundamentals of this mission. If it means that we're going to have good intentions plus more money, that may just result in fragmentation or the imposition of unsustainable initiatives. And I think we may be somewhere in between. So whatever you can do, well, in regards to the specifics of the metrics of how you're going to measure the outcomes toward the fundamental goals, which I just outlined, which I think are consistent with your mission, I'd like to understand that process more deeply. And when will you have those, and what is currently in the works? And then secondly, the issue, if you could give us an update on those who have been so heinously affected by ISIS's attempt to wipe them out, particularly in northern Iraq, the Yazidis, the Christians, and others who have throughout time claimed that as their ancestral home as well, and have provided a pluralism that's absolutely necessary for the long-term stability of greater Iraq as well.
Thank you for those questions. First, in the area of metrics, again, since I looked to join USAID, I talked about my philosophy on the journey to self-reliance. And I've lived in Africa twice in my life, and I've always been struck by the innate desire of everyone I met to shape their own future. Over and over again, people want the chance to shape their own future. Everything that we're doing is designed towards helping people do just that, is giving leaders the tools they need the information they need, yes, some of the resources they need to be able to do that. Some months back, as we began to look at the opportunity to reposture the agency around that vision, I turned to my experienced staff. I turned to people in the field, career professionals here at DC, as well as some of the outside observers that have been working in this field for a long time. And I asked them to help me determine, help me identify those metrics that can help measure a country's capacity and their commitment in the major sectors where we're working. I think commitment is as important, if not more important, than capacity, because if a country is not willing to put its own skin in the game, if it's not willing to make some of the tough choices, all the money in the world is not going to get there in terms of their rise. And so we do ask them, we say, look, we don't have all the answers, but based upon our experience, these are things that you need to do.
And commitment flows out of leadership. Virtuously oriented leadership.
Absolutely. Civil society as well as governing leadership. With respect to minorities in northern Iraq, I have to give you a great deal of the credit. As I was going through my confirmation process and we sat down and we met, you were one of the most passionate voices for helping Christians, Yazidis, and other religious and ethnic minorities who want to return to northern Iraq, helping them along the way, making sure that they had some of the assistance necessary to return to some semblance of normalcy. So we were able to mobilize modest resources almost immediately. Secondly, the money that had been previously pledged towards UNDP, we worked out an MOU with the United Nations Development Program to ensure that 55 million of the first 75 million tranche of a larger 150 million would be aimed at that area to do some restoration of essential services. And on top of that, again, I think inspired by what you brought forward, we've launched something called a broad agency announcement, which is a process we already had on the books, just weren't using all that often. And it basically said, everyone who cares about this issue and area and has some experience, what are your ideas? We don't have all the answers sitting back here, either at the agency or in DC. What are your ideas? And it's a relatively low bar for participation. I think it's a 2-page statement of interest, gets the process going. And the input and interest we got was, quite frankly, overwhelming. So we're moving to a point in the process where we hope to be able to announce what the outcome will be and how that programming will go. But we think it offers real hope for making sure that we're able to tailor some assistance that protects that diversity.
Do you have a time, Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry, a timeline on that?
Well, I had forgotten, I'm actually going to Iraq soon myself in a matter of weeks, and at that point, we're hoping to be able to make an announcement. Yes.
Oh, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Fortenberry. Before I recognize Ms. Meng, I'd like to recognize the ranking member.
Just for a moment, but I just wanted to welcome these wonderful young people who are here for their day. I don't know if it's the whole day in Congress, but this is a gentleman who's talking with us about the whole world, and he's very smart. So you really should listen to him carefully, and maybe you'll join one of these organizations as you age. Thank you very much for coming today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, I cannot resist. The ranking member was nice enough to say I am smart, so I will just say she is nice enough to also display her diplomatic skills.
Well, welcome to our young visitors. Thank you for joining us today.
Mr. Chairman, may I
Absolutely
introduce them?
Sure.
Thank you very much. Yes. First of all, I was going to do this on my time when hopefully got back, but thank you very much, Congresswoman Lowy. Talea Frost, why don't you stand up, who is 12 years old. Talea lives in Brownstone, Michigan. Hey. Her father was in the Navy, passed away in 2010, and good to see you, Ty. Also, we have Tyzia Frost, who is 9 years old, and Arabella Wilson, who is also 9 years old. And who lives in Pennsylvania? Parker, Pennsylvania, because our chairman lives in Pennsylvania and represents Pennsylvania. So thank you very much. Might be one of your constituents.
Where in Pennsylvania do you live?
Where is it? Parker, Pennsylvania?
Oh, Parker. Okay, I'm sorry.
Parker,
Okay.
Pennsylvania, and has one brother. So thank you all very much. You're representing us very well. Glad to see you today.
Well, thank you for those introductions, and we'll happy to provide formal excuses to school today to explain why you were not there today. So delighted you're here.
They're in school here, believe me. We learn a lot every day.
This is better than a doctor's excuse. Okay. Okay, I'd like to recognize Ms. Meng for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Administrator Green, for your service. I applaud USAID for its recent guidance ensuring that aid delivered and funded by the U.S. government is labeled in the appropriate language with the message from the American people. There are USAID commissioned reports and ample anecdotal evidence demonstrating that this fosters goodwill and positive views of Americans abroad. I know Mr. Dent referred to this, and Chairman Rogers alluded to what is often the American people's overestimation of U.S. aid, foreign aid to other countries, and the underestimation of the return on our investment. So I was wondering, what are other examples in which USAID has pursued policies showcasing that the good work it is doing is supported by the American people? And on the other end, how can we better advocate for that development with the American people here in the United States?
Thank you. First, I was reminded that it is Take Your Child to Work Today Day, also at USAID. Because I'm here, I had cut a video in advance swearing in a number of visiting members of USAID who are back running the place probably better than I ever could. If I can, you ask a very important question. I'll give you my honest opinion that dates back to my days as an ambassador. I just don't think we do this very well. From the American people, I think, is the right tagline. Quite frankly, I think it should be across the board. It doesn't matter to someone receiving food aid in Yemen that it's from USAID versus another part of the U.S. government. None of this is from the government. It's all from the American people. I think we need to do a better job of pushing that out. We're also making sure, to be very honest, sometimes I worry that our implementing partners, the way that they brand the assistance that we provide, sometimes it implies that it's actually their assistance as opposed to coming from hardworking taxpayers. We're actually undertaking an effort right now to tighten that up a little bit. We're delighted at the work that they do as partners, but this comes from hardworking families all across the United States of America who give generously. We want to make sure that they receive credit. But it goes further than that. I personally believe that we do best when our programs, we don't tie them to an administration, we don't tie them to an individual. We just say, look, it's from the American people to the people of Tanzania or the people of Yemen. I think we need to constantly remind those that we are trying to assist that this really is part of the American character. This is who we are as Americans. And we just don't do that often enough. Specifically, we have revamped our website, I think, to make it easier to use and to help us push out the messages more often. Secondly, I'm trying to push out more voices within USAID. We have a tendency to use my face and voice way too often. We have wonderful, talented people from all over the world, from all walks of life, and I want to push those voices out because I think that's a better way of demonstrating who we are as a people, what we stand for, and that this is entirely broad-based. So that's something that we need to do a better job of. And I think also our youth work. We're really working hard at providing modest seed money to reinforce youth groups in civil society to essentially foster the next generation of partners, allies, implementing partners. We think that's the other way to make sure that everybody understands that this is literally a people-to-people enterprise.
Thank you. And just really quickly, I know I'm running out of time, just wanted to change gears and talk about concern about the spread of mosquito-borne diseases in certain areas where previously they did not even exist. Just go straight to the question, how, I know we've previously touched on this, but how can you describe or guarantee how global health security will be prioritized with all these budget cuts?
I'm a malaria survivor from my days as a teacher in Kenya, long time ago now. So it is personal to me, and I've had students pass from malaria back from those teaching days. So mosquito-borne illnesses in particular are near and dear to my heart, and it's the work I did when I first came back to Washington, D.C. Global health security, quite frankly, thanks to the generosity of this committee, there is a reserve fund for what we do against pandemics, and it's terrifically important. It is a priority to us, priority to me personally. I've got to tell you that need is outstripping resources. We look at the cholera challenges in Yemen, the cholera challenges in Haiti and elsewhere. There are just a lot of challenges that we need to meet. Our President's Malaria Initiative, that program is one of the most successful programs that we have in global health, and I'd like to build on those lessons, which is the mobilization of resources, the focusing on individual countries and making sure that you have clear metrics to measure progress, and also enhancing the capacity of frontline healthcare workers, because the disease, the afflictions may change, but if you have skilled nurses and healthcare workers and laboratory facilities, obviously that helps you not simply with the particular cause through which the funding may flow, but for other causes which undoubtedly will come.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. I'd like to recognize Mr. Price for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Ambassador Green, to our subcommittee. We're glad to see you. And I want to congratulate you on hitting the ground running, as they say, at the agency, and particularly on some of these very promising and overdue reorganization efforts, which we're eager to collaborate on with you. We work hard on this subcommittee to enact bipartisan appropriations bills, and we worked in a cooperative fashion to reject and correct the last year's budget proposal coming from the administration in major ways. I'm afraid the 2019 budget, though, looks like more of the same. It's alarming, the degree of these cuts and how much damage they would do. I won't ask you to comment in general on that, but I do want to focus on something you know a great deal about and have a passion for, and that is the support we give to governance and democracy in some of the most unstable and dangerous parts of the world. And this is basic. If government fails, everything fails. I serve as the ranking Democrat on the House Democracy Partnership. As you know, it's a congressional commission that works to strengthen parliaments in emerging democracies. We've worked hand in glove with USAID in supporting the development assistance programming on the ground. I think it's been a good complementary relationship. USAID and its contractors, such as IRI under your leadership, NDI, RTI, these organizations have been instrumental in improving democratic practice in countries otherwise challenged by financial hardship and dangerous conflict. I'm sure you're aware that our subcommittee's directed in each of the last few years that legislative strengthening programs be conducted in every country HDP is operating in. Yet this budget proposal cuts assistance to various HDP partner countries by more than 70%. These are countries we've identified as emerging democracies in critical regions whose governments are eager and ripe for democratic reform. Sri Lanka, cut by 74%. Liberia's development assistance, cut by 84%. Georgia's overall assistance cut by 76%. And a cut almost that large in Ukraine of all places. Guatemala, development assistance cut by 41%. Former UK Prime Minister David Cameron chaired a much-touted commission recently and noted that poverty alleviation, the need for assistance in teetering countries. He wrote that half the impoverished people of the world will live in fragile states by 2030. That is not far off. Yet the administration's request proposes to cut democracy and governance assistance by 40% overall, to cut USAID program by over 30%. So I'd like you to comment on a couple of things. First, to give us your interpretation of where governance and democracy assistance, how it stands with respect to U.S. security interests and other aid priorities. How would a 40% cut to governance and democracy assistance affect the work USAID is doing in fragile democracies? And then maybe remark particularly on what happens when we leave a country prematurely. We've seen a lot of that in HDP. We've made investments, and yet we are quick to move on to other priorities, other countries. How's USAID working to ensure that we don't prematurely abandon USAID's mission in a country where we've made investments and where the full promise of those has not yet been realized?
Thanks, Congressman. Good to see you again. And as you know, I'm a big supporter of HDP and the work that HDP does around the world. The importance of democracy and responsive governance, as you alluded to, is important to me personally. We are, as we go through our redesign, our transformation process, we'll be working with you because one of our key metrics as we measure country capacity is around democracy. It's around democracy and also the health of civil society. I share your point of view. Our investments are not sustainable unless we also foster responsive governance. One of the changes that I'm trying to bring to USAID is a renewed emphasis on responsive governance. Sometimes in the development sector, we see an emphasis on governance, which is very important, but authoritarians may be good at governance. It's responsive governance, obviously, that is the key. And so that is what we're trying to measure and foster as we go. So we're working on these metrics. Secondly, we certainly take note of what the committee and what the Congress has allocated in the omnibus bill, the 2018 omnibus, towards democracy and governance, and the important priority that has been placed with that earmark. And our job will be to utilize those funds as best as we possibly can. Finally, you ask a really important question about leaving a country. In the journey to self-reliance, as we talk about it, we talk about strategic transitions towards, I won't say the end of the journey, but perhaps the final phases. And I don't see that as leaving or turning off the lights. I look at a place like India, in which we have a robust presence there, but our work is fundamentally different than it was just a few years ago. Decades ago, India was a country that received food aid. If we mentioned to them food aid, they'd be quite insulted these days. Instead, what we're doing in India is helping to catalyze private investment. We're helping them to pilot new technologies with the understanding that we can help them test them and they scale them up. And so that, to me, is a transition. It's a new relationship, but it is a fundamentally important relationship, and it's not walking away. We do have a tendency, the U.S. government, over the last number of decades, where we get some irrational exuberance, and we tend to look at an election as democracy, and therefore we can walk away, and it's almost always a mistake. We almost always regret it. So for us, a transition is the beginning of a conversation about what a relationship can look like. In most cases, it's a private sector driven one because that's what the country is looking for. But it's very important to me that we continue to have a close working relationship based on shared experiences and shared values and shared ideals. And so we're looking in a few countries like in India as to what that can look like. I'll give you another example. I was just down in Peru, and in the jungles of Peru, I was looking at a very successful program that we have. Our partner is DeVita, Spanish for our counterpart there, working around coca eradication together with alternative economics. What they've discovered, what we've discovered is you can pull up coca plants all day long, but if you don't bring anything behind them, if you don't work with communities to create alternative livelihoods and some sense of an infrastructure that allows for progress, the coca will come back. That program that we have going in Peru, there was a day in which we almost funded it entirely. We're now the minority funder. It is the government of Peru and private business that are doing most of the funding. Our role is relatively small, and my guess is it'll get smaller as it goes, and it's a great thing. It is helping to foster something based upon our skills, our experience, our capacities, and then having them take it over so that it's theirs and they're leading it. That, to me, is the model for what we should be aiming to do. In some countries, those days are not far off. In other countries, is a long way off. But in every case, it is working with those countries to help them lead their own future.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I think if you have time, Mr. Administrator, I'd like to do a second round.
Mr. Chairman, I always have time for you.
That's why he's paid the big bucks. He has a feeling. Let me ask you about Central America and what we're getting for our investment there. That southwest border, entryway for all of the drugs that are ruining the nation, our country, as well as illegals and law enforcement problems. We've invested heavily in Colombia, well, all across Southern and Central America. Tell us about what good it's doing and what's the prospects. I mean, we've invested tons of money, $2.5 billion for the so-called U.S. strategy for Central America. Over half that funding is managed by USAID. What can you tell us that we could raise some hopes on?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Some of the first work that I took a look at and examined upon arrival at USAID was the work that we're doing in the Northern Triangle. I took an early trip down to Mexico City to meet with all of our mission directors from the region, as well as AMICID, which is our Mexican counterpart, a younger development agency, but looking to partner with us. And it's challenging work, but we are seeing progress being made where we're able to invest dollars to push back against some of the growth in gangs, as challenging as it is. Some of the alternative economics programs that I described with respect to Peru is bearing some fruit. But part of what we need to do in these countries is to help build the capacity of local mayors, local police chiefs, community leaders to create safe places for families so that you don't have unaccompanied minors out of desperation driven miles through some of the worst conditions on the face of the earth to head north for security and safety. And so it may seem like slow going, but the work is, we believe, terrifically important. We also have tremendous economic interest there. And so if we're able to foster rule of law, governing capacity, work around fighting corruption, and it's uneven work, it's challenging work, it's in our economic interests. It helps to create commercial opportunities for American business and also stronger ties between the U.S. and that region of the world. So the work is bearing fruit, but we have much more to do. We've pulled together across the interagency some ideas to enhance the work, to work together around developing disaster response capacities, and I'm hopeful that we'll be able to pull something together and brief you on it in coming months. But we think it's very much in U.S. interest to continue our engagement there.
Well, the unrest and corruption and general malaise in Central America and on into South America has led to a flood of drugs coming to us principally out of Colombia, but by way of Central America and by way of Mexico and into this country, speeded along the way by the huge, brutal cartels in Mexico. I know that's a law enforcement matter, but the conditions that allow that problem to fester is something that you've been working on for we've been working on for a long time, apparently without too much success. Would you agree with that or not?
What I can say is that in areas where we've been able to focus resources, an example would be San Pedro Sula in Honduras. We have seen a dramatic reduction in crime, a dramatic reduction in the activities of gangs. And so we see that the work succeeds and makes progress, but it is certainly uneven. We're working with at-risk youth to try to prevent the growth and spread of gangs. Going forward, I think a key part of our work is good governance. And as you know, the monies that you generously provided in the omnibus bill toward the Central America strategy requires certifications on progress in fighting corruption, in strengthening the work of the attorneys general, in battling against some of the corruption that has led too easily to some of the conditions that you're talking about. We support those requirements, and we support helping to enhance the capacity of those nations to meet the requirements, to push back against the conditions that I think too easily foster what you're rightly pointing to.
Let me switch gears briefly here before yielding on metrics. I don't know whether that's been covered in the testimony so far or not.
A little bit.
And my definition, roughly, of the metrics matter is how do we objectively measure the need in one of these programs in a particular part of the world, and how do we also then measure whether or not it's working, an objective analysis of the money we're spending. How can we grade that, judge it?
Thanks for the question, and I think you point to a very important distinction that I probably not have done a very good job of enunciating. So we use metrics in two different ways. There are the metrics that we have around every program, every grant, third-party monitoring, the monitoring and evaluation that we do to actually measure what the program delivers, how the program is working, to ensure that there isn't lost resources, diversion of resources, vitally important. And I think USAID has led the world in doing that. We're well known for it and will absolutely continue. It's important. Along with that, of course, is the work of the Inspector General. Secondly, there are the metrics that we've been talking about earlier today, and these are the metrics that are being pulled together to help us think through long-term priorities, helping to assess where countries are in their own development progress. MCC has metrics that we all help to develop that are designed to say when a country is eligible to receive any funding. This is not that. These are countries with whom we're already working, but it's aimed at seeing where they are as they build the capacities that we all believe are necessary to advance, and also making sure that there is commitment, that they are putting resources in so that we know that this is not something that's being forced upon them, but that we are sharing this journey. Those metrics are long-term. They don't define when we work with a country. Hopefully, we come to you and we all talk about how these metrics can help us think through where funding priorities should be in the long run. And those are metrics about development. But the very important metrics that you're pointing to, the monitoring and evaluation, that absolutely continues. It's enshrined in our redesign effort. The learning that we get from every program, every place we work is vitally important to not just USAID, but the development community.
That kind of information is critical for us in trying to design a bill and fund what is working and not fund that which is not working, but also selling that idea to our brethren and sisters in the Congress as well as the countryside. So yes. Proof that what you're doing is working is important. Quickly, rescissions. We hear a lot of talk about a possible rescission bill. Some of us are concerned that a possible rescission might seek to take away monies from 2017 and perhaps earlier that are unobligated balances. If that should happen, tell us what the practical result of that would be.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman, I think you have more information than I do, quite frankly, on the process. I would refer you to the White House. What we've been instructed to do is to continue on as we normally do in the planning process coming out of 2018. Obviously, we will move the money that is appropriated for us. The needs are out there. As we've talked about, there are needs on the humanitarian front everywhere we look around the world. There are also some important development opportunities, strategic and economic. So, I can't tell you we have excess resources because we don't. The money that you've generously provided, the needs are great.
Well, and the normal process of these funds being obligated is a multi-year matter, is it not? So that if you go back and rescind, say, 2017 monies that were programmed into the normal process that would not be spent for a couple of years under normal circumstances, if you cut that off at the neck, you're running a real risk of a problem, aren't we?
Mm-hmm. Mr. Chairman, I didn't fully appreciate until I arrived at USAID just what it is that you're laying out in terms of how long that arc is, in terms of moving from when funds are appropriated and allocated to when they're fully obligated. In some cases, it does take some time. But again, we don't have excess funds. The funds that we receive, we push out as prudently, as efficiently as we possibly can.
It's an arcane process.
It is your words, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Lilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, I apologize. There are many hearings going on. But getting back to the issues at hand, thank you again. The White House is currently conducting 2 assistance reviews, one on stabilization efforts in Syria, one on assistance to the West Bank and Gaza. While there are sensitive issues, and these are sensitive areas where assistance should support our foreign policy objectives, I am worried that these reviews may have consequences like breaks in programming or negative outcomes. First, what is USAID's role in these reviews, and when can we expect them to conclude? And in the case of West Bank and Gaza, why is all assistance to the region being held, even for programs that do not directly impact the peace process? And at what point will these reviews compromise programs through delays or expiration of funds? So first, if you can discuss USAID's role in these reviews and when can they expect to be concluded?
Thank you, Congresswoman. Actually, in both cases, our understanding is that the reviews should be completed soon. I don't have a precise date, but we are, like you, eagerly anticipating their completion. With respect to West Bank, Gaza, we've been in discussion with all of the affected partners in the interagency. We've been in touch with the World Food Program as well. Part of what I think our role is to explore with partners what needs are, how gaps are being filled. So that's our role in this process. With respect to the Syria funding that you made reference to, as you know, I don't believe that humanitarian assistance is affected, so we continue to provide humanitarian assistance. And as we always have, that's as to need, not as to whether the area is controlled by the regime or another force. We continue to do that work, but the stabilization assistance has been, the $200 million has been held pending a review by the White House, and I know the interagency process is working on it literally as we speak.
I would appreciate any information on both issues, but I'm very concerned that in West Bank and Gaza, all assistance is being held. And as you know, we are all focused on the peace process, but in the meantime, I worry about UNRWA, I worry about the schools, I worry about feeding programs, and this is not a healthy response, and I think it could really put children, families in jeopardy. So can you tell me again on that issue, when will these reviews be completed? Do you have any idea? And will they compromise these programs through delays or expiration of funds?
Thank you, Congresswoman. First off, some of the accounts to which you're referring are not actually administered by USAID. UNRWA, for example, is administered by the State Department, so I would refer you to them.
And you have no input into that?
Well, again, we talk about needs all the time, but no, it's a state-managed account. In terms of the precise timing, I honestly don't have any more information. What we will do is I'll make sure my staff follows up with yours, and as much information as we are capable of providing, we'll provide. We are watching the situation obviously closely as well. Our humanitarian obligations are such that we pay close attention to it and are watching.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Lee.
Thank you very much. Let me just make one comment with regard to the promotion of the good things we're doing abroad, and oftentimes not getting the credit, which quite frankly U.S. taxpayers should get credit for. UNFPA, for example, I saw pictures of cribs that prior to the cuts, the 69 million cut to UNFPA, there was a USAID little sign on a crib. Now USAID is nowhere in that crib anymore. And this is throughout the world. So just know that the more we cut back and withdraw, I think the view of our country as it relates to our commitment to development and diplomacy is beginning to diminish. I want to ask you, and this is not a question as it relates to your personal views, Mr. Ambassador, because I think we met when you were on the continent of Africa. And so don't take this personally, but I want to ask you about the S-hole countries that the president talked about, and look at this budget, because as I look at this budget, the S-hole countries are getting they're getting large cuts, you know, from our accounts. And I haven't been able to go through every country right now, but each one that I've been able to go through on the continent of Africa are receiving some huge cuts, which makes me wonder, are the budget cuts following the attitude about the continent of Africa, and are the policies following this general attitude about the continent? Because China is on the move on the continent. we're disengaging and divesting from the continent, and it does reflect an attitude of this administration, not yourself personally, but this administration, that these are countries that really, they do believe are SO countries.
Congresswoman, I would just say, first off, we must remind ourselves we're the largest donor of humanitarian assistance in the world, and nobody else is even close. Even under the reduced budget amounts in 19, we are far and away the largest contributor.
So we're the wealthiest country in the world also, and our,
yes,
what, 1% of our total budget. Mm-hmm. So, Mr. Ambassador, we need to be up at least to 25% before I can even agree that that is even something we can accept.
Well, but I think it's important to realize that we are still the leading donor of humanitarian assistance in the world, and I think that's a point of pride, and it is something that we should be very much proud of.
But we're cutting it every year.
We are still the leading donor, and number 2 and 3 put together don't equal what we were doing. As you know, I am an advocate for, you know, we have humanitarian needs in many parts of the world, but to be fair, we are the largest donor of humanitarian assistance. We are asking others to do more, and I think they are doing more, and that's all a good thing. I think we all think that that's a good thing to do. We recognize that tough choices are being made. You know, we continue to be, and I'm very proud of this, we are the leading development assistance country in the world. I believe that USAID is the premier international development agency in the world, and I believe that our humanitarian assistance is second to none. And I don't say that as an argument for doing less. I say it as a point of pride and, quite frankly, gratitude to all of you.
Mr. Ambassador, okay, granted, everything you said, true. Still a very small portion of our federal budget, 1.5%. Secondly, the question I asked is in terms of the budget as it relates to the continent of Africa, in terms of the divestment and the budget cuts, I'd like to look at and find what cuts and the proportion of cuts of this overall 30% cut are directed to the continent of Africa. And I have a special, you know, understanding of the continent of Africa and their challenges. And I know for a fact that you would not support the SO country framework that this administration has. But when I look at the budget and these cuts are disproportionately affecting the continent of Africa.
The allocations that are made on the development side are made on the basis of need and opportunity. That's how the Feed the Future countries are chosen target countries. It's based upon opportunity and commitment of our partners. Our PEPFAR programs are obviously disproportionately in Africa because that's where the greatest need is. So you know, I'm very proud of the work that we do in Africa and the tools that we provide. I think we do more than anyone else. I do think we need to be careful in terms of the rise of China and the rival model it presents. But we don't take a back seat to anyone in terms of the investments that we make, the humanitarian assistance that we provide.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, but I hope that one day you'll understand what I'm saying in terms of this budget and the framework that this administration has viewed the continent of Africa and the perception on the continent now as it relates to these cuts and the perspective of the continent. So thank you again.
Mr. Fortenberry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And while you had been out of the room, Mr. Chairman, we did discuss the issue of metrics as well. So I'm glad that you highlighted it and put an accent mark on it. And I do think that this is very important, and I want to return to it for just a moment. I think it would be helpful to all of us as you work through defining that more clearly, you actually keep us informed, because metrics are based on certain premises as well. And then you have to have space for judgment. So if we over-objectify everything, you don't have the flexibility and malleability that is needed, that can never be quantified based upon all the variables that are out there. So this is a complicated task. Without objectives or metrics, you can get fragmentation and chaos. With too much of it codified, you can have a paralysis of analysis. So there's a balance here, and I think that also necessitates ongoing communications with us so that we can help identify, again, the working premises, whether they are based upon intensity of poverty, intensity of diplomatic or military missions that rise unpredictably, and other variables. The other is, again, committed leadership. Now, the chairman mentioned Central America, and then you mentioned San Pedro Sula. I visited there several years ago, went to a place called Dos Caminos in a suburb of there, near there, where the highest murder rate in the world exists, or existed. You gave me some new information. And we looked at a NGO USAID project where a bakery run by women received a little bit of subsidy. One of the women who was a principal in this, her husband had been killed 3 weeks earlier by the violence. But to see both younger women and older women coming together in a collaborative business initiative, beaming with pride, being successful, making plans to scale this regionally, combating despair and poverty and disorder very courageously, was quite moving to me. And I'm gratified to hear that these efforts, among others, have now reduced this murder rate substantially. That's very helpful. But the bigger issue here is, again, scalability. So what did we do? We took a little bit of resource working with partner agencies who are out there, and we took the limited capacity that existed and where the risk profile, if you just use business terms, is too great for any business to start up. And we subsidized that, provided some technical expertise, and then let it potentially succeed. I think that this actually is the way forward to, if we can combine the best of what we traditionally call private market initiative with some public subsidy where it cannot exist simply because the structures aren't there, then we move from false economic expectations that are based upon certain premises that we have that we don't even take for granted, namely structure, trust, contracts, enforcement of contracts, property rights, and the rest of it. And then we start to create those systems in a parallel way to actually helping attack the structures of poverty that exist in so many places. You also mentioned, so I love the name of this place, by the way, Dos Caminos, two pathways, one of poverty, despair, and death, or one of brightness and hope and opportunity. And so it was, again, one of those scalable ideas that's out there that I think is a part of what we ought to really integrate, and you've been touching on it all throughout your testimony. Another example, Haiti to our south, our own backyard, our own neighborhood. We have so many interactions with Haiti. It is so strategic. It is so proximate. The long-held relationship, the volatility, the poverty, and yet the beautiful depth of spirit of the people there, and the number of Haitians who have migrated to our country, all necessitates a particular emphasis there that we do have, and yet we have to be very guarded against creating an aid-dependent culture because we haven't built the systems necessary for continuity. When we can leverage the best of the private market system with what might be an initial public subsidy, or a necessary initial public subsidy, with committed leadership that is based in virtue, and certain metrics, social metrics that are defined, the return on that is huge versus writing checks that create unsustainable problems. I'm sorry there's not really an embedded question there. I'm kind of editorializing out loud and affirming some of what you're doing in order to encourage you in this task, but also to suggest that you have a lot of heart here on this subcommittee and a lot of investment of time and energy. And so as you work through these metrics, I think pulling us in, seeing us not...
We will, all of these, your staff will be briefed and consulted. We are looking for your input very much.
Yeah, seeing us as partners in this. The other quick point, re-examining language. I challenged us a little bit on the word development. What does that really mean? It's an old word. In the old days, it used to imply something. It may not anymore. Direct foreign investment, I think, should become investment partnerships. It's not about us doing this. It's about
finding committed leadership elsewhere for continuity and sustainability. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I'm going to recognize Mr. Price next, but briefly, Ms. Louie, do you have a question you want?
Yes.
You're recognized.
Okay. Actually, before I get to my question, because I think it's very related to what my colleague was saying, I can remember a visit to Tanzania, I hope it's still there, several years ago, and Land O'Lakes. Were you with us, Craig? No, with Jim Colby. And Land O'Lakes partnered with the women in Tanzania, and they stood taller. They were so proud of their success and the profits they made, and these partnerships between the private sector and what we are doing to assist are absolutely essential. But I will get to my questions very quickly. And you could just answer yes or no. Women are more than half of the world's population. Research shows that they are key to more stable communities and healthy families. Our national security and development objectives will not be achieved if we deprioritize women. Okay, yes or no? Cutting support to Gavi, eliminating vulnerable children programs, cutting funding for maternal and child health programs by 25% will harm women, children, and babies. You could just say yes or no, because I know our hearing is about to close.
We continue to make huge investments in all those areas. With the 18 budget, as you know, we fulfilled our pledging obligation to Gavi. We are continuing to fund Gavi. We think the innovations that we're getting from Gavi, we being all of us, are extraordinarily valuable. You will see in our redesign efforts and in our programming enshrining the principles that you're talking about, making sure that we have women's empowerment, making sure that we have, obviously, gender equity in our programs. We agree with all of those sentiments. In terms of specific dollar amounts, I readily admit that tough trade-offs are involved and difficult choices have been made, and we're not meeting every need that's out there that we see.
Okay, another quick question. 131 million girls are out of school. 131 million girls around the world are out of school. Can a 50% cut to basic education programs improve girls' access to education?
Congresswoman Lowy, as you know, I started off as a teacher in Africa. That's how I started in all of this process. It is near and dear to my heart. We do not have enough money, nor could you get for us enough money to meet every education need that is out there, to provide enough teachers, to provide access for every girl and every boy in Africa in education. It's simply true. Although I will say I think that the monies you have generously provided, we will put to good use. You have my word on it. You have been a champion. We are fulfilling the principles that you've enshrined in the READ Act, and we'll do everything we can to make these programs go as far as we possibly can.
And lastly, you can just say yes or no. Has USAID determined the impact that a 25% cut to water and sanitation programs would have on women, given in most cultures they bear the primary burden for collecting clean water? Also, how will the cut impact women's abilities to pursue the economic opportunities that you and I all recognize to be so important?
Well, I can honestly say I have not seen that analysis or determination done. What I can say is the amount requested for the WASH program is the largest amount ever requested for the WASH program. It exceeds what was requested last year and the previous year. It is not as much as you generously provided in the 18 appropriations.
It's a 25% cut. And I know that the chairman and I in this committee, as you can see, there's real bipartisan support for these programs, and we look forward to being your partner, and we thank you very, very much. We are thrilled to have a leader who cares and has the knowledge to fulfill the important challenges. So thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, ma'am. Mr. Price.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Administrator, I want to touch on a couple of points from earlier discussions and then move to a critical question about Burma and Bangladesh. But this metrics discussion, I think, is important. We've all struggled with it. It's especially challenging, I think, when you think about aid to governance efforts. The Frost-Solomon Commission in Eastern Europe years ago struggled with it. When does a country graduate? When do you think the work is over? And of course, we struggle with it now with HDP. I think your observation that sometimes one doesn't just cut off, one moves to a different kind of support. With the India example, that's a useful point. I think it also goes without saying that budget cuts of the magnitude we're talking about in this budget, Sri Lanka 74%, Liberia 84%, and so forth. That's not based on any kind of that's not based on any kind of metric. I know that without asking. There's no metric proving or showing success that that would justify that kind of cut. I do think the plea for consultation from both sides of the aisle here is important. These are subtle matters. These are not easily reduced to simplistic measures, and we need to be sharing the best information we have about the state of play in these countries before these decisions to terminate or to shift the kind of aid are made. Underscore also the importance of the West Bank Gaza matter, the humanitarian assistance there. It's a matter of desperation, as you know. These programs are running out of money. USAID ought to be a part of this White House review, and I would hope that in Syria too. I mean, there's some ambiguity here today about exactly what's been cut off in Syria, how much humanitarian aid is still flowing in Syria. I can't imagine that whatever the disputes might be, that they would justify holding this up any longer. Now, finally, to Bangladesh and Burma. You of course know the statistics about the number of Rohingya who have fled from Burma. 700,000 is the latest number I've seen. Awful campaign of ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity in Rakhine State. Bangladesh is to be applauded, I think, for opening its borders and receiving the huge influx of refugees and working to protect the Rohingya. I've heard, though, that there are significant bureaucratic constraints that are impeding the delivery of aid to the Rohingya refugees in Cox's Bazar by U.S. and other international NGOs. What are you doing to ensure that American NGOs, other international organizations, are able to operate effectively to meet the needs of these refugees? And in regard to assistance to Burma, it's been documented that the Burmese are bulldozing and building on top of Rohingya villages under the guise of international development. Makes repatriation nearly impossible. I know that USAID does not provide assistance to infrastructure projects in Rakhine State, but are you working with the development partners, like the Japanese, like the World Bank, to ensure that assistance provided takes into account such human rights issues?
All right, thank you. You raise a number of very important points. First, on metrics, to be very clear, first off, we will consult. It's our obligation, just as we have on the structural piece. We did more than 40 consultations with your staff and with Congress. Absolutely have my commitment. We will be doing the same thing on metrics. Our metrics are not our own. We have tapped into the brightest minds in the development community, many of the outside groups, our own advisory council, and we'll continue to show you what we're looking at. These will not be metrics for purposes of cutting off aid. This is not MCC. These are not a report card. It is instead very broad-based indicators that help us understand what a country's capacities are and where their weaknesses may lie, so that we can be sure to help them address challenges so they can continue to rise. So that's how we use metrics. Secondly, I'm planning to go to Burma and Bangladesh myself in the next couple of weeks. One of the great challenges that we have is access, as the rest of the development and diplomatic community have been having. It's a great challenge in getting there. I know the UN Security Council is attempting to go to Rakhine soon is the plan, as in days from now. We'll be taking note of that. I want to get there myself. I agree with your assessment on Bangladesh. Again, I think challenges, they're not so much bureaucratic challenges as challenges of access. But we want to make sure that we continue to provide humanitarian assistance, which we have been and will continue to do. But also there are long-term development needs that need to be addressed as well. But we have been providing humanitarian assistance and support on the global health side, and we'll continue to do that. And we're in constant touch with our multilateral partners. I met with the UN Commissioner, High Commissioner for Refugees just last week to talk at greater length about Burma and Bangladesh. I've met with Amnesty International. I've met with a number of figures. I just spoke to the ambassador to Burma as well to make sure that we have accurate information before we go to better prepare the trip to make it as effective as possible. I share all of your concerns. The State Department has, as you know, reached a conclusion that ethnic cleansing has taken place in northern Rakhine. They have not gone further in their determinations at this point, but it's clear that a human rights catastrophe has taken place there, and it is of great concern to obviously every single one of us. But I want to go and have eyes on myself. It's something that I need to understand and make sure that our programs are as effective as they can be, and they're getting to where they need to go and having the outcomes that obviously you desire.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Price. Mr. Ambassador, thank you again for your time this morning, your testimony. You've set forth some ambitious goals for this agency, which we welcome. You face great humanitarian and development challenges across the world. In the weeks ahead, this committee will closely examine the budget request, assess its impacts, recommend funds that we can pass on to the full House that enable us to achieve your goals and ours, and to further our nation's economic and security interests. I think I speak for the whole subcommittee when I say we are thrilled that you're the leader of this organization. We think you are doing a great job with it under difficult circumstances. And I was thinking here a while ago as we were talking about some of the hot spots around the world, that that's all you deal with. You are...
I don't read the newspaper as innocently as I used to.
But there must be times when you become disappointed, inadequate. There must be times when some of these conditions that you see every day around the world cause you great mental pain. And so we want to encourage your spirit, and we want you to keep up your commitment. We know you will. You have. But we wish you all the best, and we're here to help any way that we can. Thank you.
Thank you, and I'm very grateful for the support that you've shown, and I really appreciate the partnership. Just close with this, Mr. Chairman. Every trip that I've taken, I haven't taken that many, but every trip that I've taken as administrator, I come across at least one moment in which I encounter someone that just lifts everything up. When you see the spirit of the people with whom we work, things that they have done, that makes it all worthwhile. We being the U.S. people, I think we make a difference, and I think our leadership matters. But I am very grateful to all of you for your support. I really am.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Committee stands adjourned.